Okay, so finishing up chapter 13, we're going to now get into the motor responses for the somatic side. So last video we talked about integration of somatic function, kind of bringing information in and where it was wired to. Now we're going to talk about the output. So we're going to talk about some of the components of motor processing, talk about the pathway for descending motor commands, talk about some of the different descending pathways, both in terms of structure and function, and then we're going to get a peek at some of the reflex arcs and their roles. So when it comes to responses, we want to kind of remind ourselves about some of the areas that are important to send out signals, right, to kind of formulate that response, right? So these are all the components that are going to be involved with motor output. So the prefrontal cortex, this is found in the frontal lobe. This is important for executive functions, so like memory, attention, personality. This area doesn't elicit movement directly, so it's not going to be involved in sending a signal out to cause movement, but it can maybe have an effect on what movements you decide to make, right, based on your personality and whatnot. The secondary motor cortices, these are all the other regions of the frontal lobe that do produce movement. This includes the premotor cortex and the supplemental motor area. These are important for maintaining like your posture during a movement so that you don't lose your balance, planning and coordinating that movement, the frontal eye field, so the movement of your eyes, and then the Broca's area, which is to allow you to produce speech. So all of these areas are going to help make a smooth, coordinated movement. The primary motor cortex, this is what's generally going to be sending out the signals to cause muscle contraction, right? So it's kind of the main player, and then the secondary motor cortices are all kind of helping out. That primary motor cortex, again, is in the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe, right before that central sulcus. If you remember that map, right, with the homunculus, the motor homunculus map, that was showing which parts of the primary motor cortex control which body parts. And again, this is just going to send a signal down through the spinal cord to tell skeletal muscles to contract. So motor output coming from the cortex is going to descend into the brainstem and then down into the spinal cord through motor neurons. And there's two different pathways we can take. We can be part of the corticospinal tract or the corticobulbar tract. The corticobulbar tract is ipsilateral, meaning like if the axon from the cortex is on the same side, it's going to control that side. So if it's coming from the right, it's going to control the right. If it's coming from the left, it's going to control the left. And the corticobulbar tract is responsible for muscles in the face, head, and neck. And we saw that same ipsilateral wiring in the previous video, right, when we were talking about bringing sensory information in. So with the exception of the eyes, right, of visual information. So, but the muscles of the face, head, and neck are all going to be controlled by the same side, right, of the brain. The corticospinal tract is contralateral, meaning like if it's, like we're going to cross the midline. If the axons are coming from the left, it's going to control the right. If the axons are coming from the right, it's going to control the left side of the body. And we saw that same pattern too with the sensory information from last video when looking at the body, right? So we have the same kind of setup in terms of left controlling right, right controlling left with the anything coming up through the spinal cord, and anything that goes directly, like has a direct connection to the brain, is going to be right side right, left side left. So let's look at the corticospinal tract. So this is going to descend from the cortex through the white matter we find in cerebrum. And so I'm going to pass between what's called the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Remember those guys, the caudate and the putamen, found in the basal nuclei. They're going to be found in a bundle called the internal capsule. So we're going to pass through using the internal capsule. Then we pass through the midbrain as the cerebral peduncles, which then go into the pons, then into the medulla, where those tracts are going to be those large white matter tracts referred to as the pyramids. So we're going to pass through those. And then this is where we cross over. We get to the pyramidal decussation, right? And this is where we're going to cross over to the opposite side. So this is where we make that transition from right to left or left to right. When it comes to appendicular control, so we're talking about the appendages, right, the limbs, the lateral corticospinal tract is going to be involved with that. So the fibers cross at that midline, right, so we're going from right to left, left to right at the pyramidal decussation. They're going to cross over from an anterior position in the pyramids to the lateral column of the spinal cord. So we're moving from the front to the side. And that will control the muscles we find in the arms and legs. The anterior corticospinal tract, this is going to be involved with controlling the trunk. So like your abdominals, pectorals, or anything found in the chest. We do not decussate in the medulla. Instead, we're going to remain in an anterior position as we go through the brainstem and enter the spinal cord. And then we'll travel to the spinal cord level where they synapse. And then we'll decussate when we get into the ventral horn. So we're kind of staying same side, same side, same side all the way down until right before we leave. Then we're going to cross over to the opposite side, to the opposite ventral horn. So this is what we're looking at. So here's our neurons up at the precentral gyrus moving down. Move down through the cerebral peduncle in the midbrain, through the pons, into the medulla. Here are those pyramids in the anterior side. And then before we're leaving, right, decussation of the pyramids, we cross over, right, to the lateral corticospinal tract. So this is going to be for like a limb, right? And we're going to pass down to the lower motor neuron. That's going to be to the skeletal muscle. So if it's like for the appendage, right, an arm or a leg, then we're going to have this decussation of pyramids, move over to the lateral corticospinal tract, and then exit out. If it's for the trunk, right, we're moving down, same pathway, except instead of going through the decussation of pyramids, we're going to go straight down in the anterior corticospinal tract, right, and then at the last minute, we're going to cross over, right. So this pathway here that I'm tracing with my mouse, right, this is for the controlling of muscles in the limbs. The pathway I'm tracing now, this is if the muscle is found in the trunk, in the body. So they both end up crossing over, right, to make that the contralateral. It just depends on, do we do that earlier or later? Limbs do it earlier. Trunk does it last minute. If we look at the ascending and descending tracts, I'm not going to make you memorize this particular image, but just something to kind of look at. So everything in red are motor and descending pathways. Everything in blue is sensory pathways. So this is everything you see in blue here is bringing information up and into the central nervous system. Everything in red is showing things descending down. So now we get to the last thing, which is the somatic reflexes. We have two different types that we're going to go over. We have the withdrawal reflex and the stretch reflex. So the withdrawal reflex, this is when like there's some sort of stimulus that gets detected and sensed by two or more neurons in the skin when we look at the fingers. Right? The spinal cord gets that information, processes it in the spinal cord. Right? The interneurons in the spinal cord do the processing. So we do not go to the brain. And then we send an impulse out to the muscles in the arm through the spinal nerves. And the whole point is to pull the hand, pull the fingers away from the stimulus. So a good example of the withdrawal reflex would be like if you touched a hot stove, right? Or you touch something sharp, right? You put your hand on something and then there was like a sharp pin. Something that could generally cause damage, right? That stimulus is then, hey, this is not good. Remove the hand from that location to prevent further damage, right? And again, this is all processed in the spinal cord. The other one is the stretch reflex. This is when a skeletal muscle gets stretched. There's receptors called muscle spindle receptors in there that get activated. And this is going to cause the muscle to contract, right? So kind of like if you were to overdo something, right? Something were to push on you, something were to happen to cause it to stretch too far, we can do contraction to kind of bring us back, right? To do the opposite of that. So here's the withdrawal reflex. So this guy here is touching a burning candle for some reason, right? So his fingers are receiving the information that it is hot, right? That information is brought up into the spinal cord. The spinal cord interneurons do the processing. So again, we're not going to the brain. That just by processing in the spinal cord, we can be that much faster, right? Even though this is extremely rapid anyways, this can be even faster. Process in the spinal cord, and then send that signal out, hey, pull the arm away. So cause the muscles to contract that are going to allow this hand to pull back, right? In this case, he's moving his hand up, right, and away. The stretch reflex, a good example is like if you were to hit the patellar tendon, right, to cause a little bit of a stretch, right, in one of the muscles in the front of your leg. So we use that little hammer, we hit the patellar tendon there, we just hit just below the kneecap. That's going to cause that extensor muscle down below to stretch, right? That's going to activate the muscle spindle receptors, like, hey, we're stretching. Send that, right? That neuron gets excited, it sends that signal along to the spinal cord. Again, we're going to generally process all of this in the spinal cord. So that's going to then excite neurons that are going to talk to the extensor muscle. We're also going to inhibit the flexor muscle. So on the opposite end, we're going to inhibit that from contracting, so we can't contract both at the same time, while sending a signal to that extensor muscle to contract. So the whole point here is, right, we've stretched this, so we're like, hey, we've stretched this muscle, we need to do the opposite. We're going to tell in this case, the extensor muscles to contract, but also stop the muscles on the back, in this case, a flexor muscle, because the flexor muscle does the opposite job. We're going to stop that one from contracting so that we don't contract both muscles at once. Right, and again, this is all happening in the spinal cord.